Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for June 13th, 2023. On June 10th, last Saturday, the Schiller Institute convened a conference to take up the question, "The world needs JFK's vision of peace." In that discussion, we went through the speech 60 years earlier of John F. Kennedy at American University, where he put forward what could have been a policy change that would have ended forever the confrontation between East and West and put an end to geopolitics as the driving force behind US and European policy. The discussion took place at a moment when there's a danger of an escalation of the war in Ukraine against Russia. And the US, the UK, and NATO are committing to a permanent war. And we're now in the middle of NATO military exercises, which go right up to the borders of Russia. This is suicidal. Where are the statesmen today who could take up Kennedy's challenge to seek peace and overcome enmity by mutual benefit, acting for mutual benefit? And so today I want to take a deeper look at Kennedy and the Vietnam War. Much of what I'm going to be discussing is compiled in a very thorough way in James Douglas's book, JFK, The Unspeakable. But there are many other sources that have similar material. What we have to do is look at the bigger picture of what was going on with Kennedy and Vietnam to get a sense of both why he was assassinated and why it was covered up, and why it's important today to understand what he was trying to do when he was targeted and killed. Now, Kennedy was working on a plan to withdraw from Vietnam after the June 10th speech at American University. He was making overtures through back channels to Khrushchev, to Castro, to end the danger of war and instead look for common purposes that would benefit all citizens of the world. Now, part of that included the need to put an end to this imperial war that the U.S. was becoming trapped in Vietnam. But Kennedy's problem is that, with the exception of advisors, Defense Secretary McNamara and his brother Bobby Kennedy, most of his advisors believed withdrawal from Vietnam was, quote, unthinkable, unquote. This was the Cold War mentality, the idea that if you have negotiations and peace, you're appeasing the communists. And this was not only the attitude of many of his advisors that he had to fight against to avoid a war over Cuba in October 1962, but also many beliefs held by many of the people of the United States. And so Kennedy had to grapple with this question. By the autumn of 1963, could he win re-election in 1964 if he withdrew from Vietnam? Now, on October 11th, 1963, he signed a National Security Action Memorandum 263, which outlined a plan to withdraw 1,000 military personnel by the end of that year from Vietnam and to withdraw the bulk of personnel by the end of 1965. This was drafted with cooperation from General Maxwell Taylor and Defense Secretary McNamara. Now, this was at a time in which Kennedy was well aware that there was a plan underway for a coup against the president of Vietnam, Diem, which had the support of the U.S. ambassador to Vietnam, Henry Cabot Lodge, Averell Harriman, a top official with major influence in the State Department, top CIA officials, and his national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy. So the question facing JFK was, how do we get out? And how do we do it in a way that the American people will understand? And so he was engaged in many discussions with friends and political allies in September, October, and November. Let me just give you some examples. He spoke with Charles Bartlett, who was a Washington, D.C. reporter and correspondent and an old friend, in early October. And Kennedy said to him, quote, "We don't have a prayer of staying in Vietnam. We don't have a prayer of prevailing there. Those people hate us. They're going to throw our tails out of there at almost any point. But I can't give up a piece of territory like that to the communists and then get the American people to re-elect me, unquote. So this is what he was struggling with. How do you politically mobilize to do what's right in a moment where the media, the establishment, and the common popular opinion shaped by the media and that establishment go against what you know is right? In speaking with Tip O'Neill, a congressman from Massachusetts, who later became Speaker of the House, O'Neill told a biographer that Kennedy vowed he would pull American troops out of Vietnam, quote, once the 1964 election was over, unquote. There's a reminiscence of an old friend and neighbor from Hyannisport, Larry Newman, that on October 20th, 1963, Kennedy said to him, quote, the first thing I'm going to do when I'm reelected, I'm going to get the Americans out of Vietnam. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but that is my number one priority. Get out of Southeast Asia. I should have listened to MacArthur. I should have listened to de Gaulle, Kennedy said, unquote. Now, on November 2nd, a coup organized by the CIA took place in Vietnam and led to the arrest and murder of President Diem. This followed the cutoff of aid to Vietnam from the Agency for International Development that was done without Kennedy's approval. Kennedy suspected AID did it under the direction of the CIA, as the agency often functioned as a front for the CIA, as it does today with Samantha Power as the director of the AID and the Coup faction from the old Obama team of Power and Susan Rice and others supporting that. Now, on November 12th, Kennedy spoke to Senator Wayne Morris, who was an anti-war activist and one of two senators who later voted against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which led to the expansion of U.S. troop numbers in Vietnam. And he said to Morris, Wayne, I've decided to get out, definitely, unquote. Morris reported that Kennedy told him this in the Rose Garden because he was afraid of being overheard or bugged by the CIA in his comments. Later, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was put before the U.S. Congress by President Lyndon Johnson on August 5th, 1964, in response to allegations of two unprovoked attacks by North Vietnamese torpedo boats on U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. It was a false flag. The idea that these were unprovoked attacks. Language sounds familiar, yeah? Now, what happened after the Kennedy assassination is the impediment to a escalation of the war was removed. And the war hawks allowed massive increase in U.S. troops going into Vietnam. When Kennedy was president, before he was assassinated, there were just under 16,000 U.S. military personnel in Vietnam, with 1,000 scheduled because of National Security Action Memo 263 to be removed by the end of the year. So 16,000. Before the Gulf of Tonkin, a year later, there were 23,000. After that, U.S. troop strength surged to 184,000. By 1968, there were 530,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam, which ended up with over 56,000 American troops killed. And the total casualties, Vietnamese casualties from the war, the estimates are there were at least 1.3 million, with more than 1/3 of those being civilians. Now, the question of how to do this without having a backlash from both the military-industrial complex and the population was a topic Lyndon LaRouche took up in private conversation with a few of his collaborators in 2004 at the time of the Democratic National Convention in Boston. And this question came up because at that time there was a question of whether the Democrats should be more forcefully moving against George Bush's Iraq War. Well, what LaRouche said was that the mistake of JFK was to fight this as cabinet warfare, in the belief that he could either win over the war hawks to his view or hold them off until after the 1964 election and then withdraw. LaRouche said this was a trap. It made both the war and his demise inevitable. Instead, he should have used his position as president to shift public opinion away from blind loyalty to the Cold War, to correct the blunder committed when Harry Truman deserted FDR's wartime alliance with the Soviet Union and stumbled foolishly into Churchill's division of the world into two empires, turning the U.S. into a dumb giant on a British leash. Now, if you listen to what LaRouche said and then think about it in terms of the 2024 election, what has to be done today? It's necessary to build a peace movement that's not just anti-war, but based on a return to the outlook expressed publicly by Kennedy in that June 10th speech. In this context, I just want to bring you a few words from Professor Jeffrey Sachs about Biden, comparing Biden and President Kennedy. What he said is, in the context of the Ukraine war, Biden has behaved almost the opposite of JFK. He has personally and repeatedly denigrated Russian President Vladimir Putin. His administration has defined the U.S. war aim as the weakening of Russia. Biden has avoided all communications with Putin. And Sachs went on to say, Biden has refused to even acknowledge, much less address, Russia's deep security concerns. Putin repeatedly expressed Russia's ardent opposition to NATO enlargement to Ukraine, a country with a 2,000-kilometer border with Russia. The U.S. would never tolerate a Russian-Mexican or Mexican-Chinese military alliance in view of the 2,000-mile U.S.-Mexico border. It's time for Biden to negotiate with Russia on NATO enlargement as part of a broader negotiations to end the Ukraine war, end quote from Jeffrey Sachs. I would say this will not happen with Biden. Without a mobilization of citizens in the U.S. and Europe to defeat once and for all the corporate cartels of a broad-based military-industrial complex. This means that if we want to get out of this suicidal trap that we've been put in by the war hawks of the United States, the United Kingdom, and NATO, you cannot rely on elected officials unless there's a huge force at their backs insisting that they take the steps that Kennedy was considering in 1963. The only way to break this is going to be through citizens facing the truth and acting on it. And that means establishing a new security architecture and development architecture for the world. That's the Schiller Institute plan. I'm appending linking at the bottom of the description page the video from the conference last Saturday. And I urge you to watch it and think about this struggle that Kennedy was going through at a time where he was moving to change the direction of U.S. policy. This is a big task. It's not easy, but it requires commitment from a growing number of citizens to face the truth and to get their fellow citizens to face the truth as well. So thanks for joining me today. I'll see you again tomorrow. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.